kind of cat I am. I'm gonna take this whiz. Oh, hey guys, I didn't see you there. I'm just having breakfast here on this brand new dining room table that I just built. If you want to see how I made it, I don't know, maybe just watch the video. Welcome back, friends, for another one of my videos. In this video, you'll see all the steps that I had to take to make a farmhouse trestle style dining room table. Now, with every project, you have to start somewhere, right? And for this table, I decided that I would tackle creating the table base first. So my first task was to mill up some 2x6 lumber stock and cut it to size on my miter saw and then rip it to its final width on the table saw. Once I had my pieces milled to my desired dimensions, my next task was to laminate several pieces together in order to get that thickness that I needed. Now, to laminate these pieces, I simply used a combination of some wood glue and pipe clamps. Now, as you can see, I made the mistake of using way too much wood glue here because I was pouring it from this big bottle. You want to make sure that you have good coverage, but you definitely don't need to overdo it. I accidentally added way too much glue here, which created a bit of a mess for me on the next step, as you'll see. So yeah, maybe just do as I say, not as I do in this situation. I left these laminated pieces clamped up overnight, and the next day I came and took them out of the clamps, and as you can see, I had to really fight some of the pieces to come apart.
I must break you.
That one was on me though, for using too much glue when I glued them up. So after several rounds, I ended up winning that fight and got them apart, and my next step was to get as much of the dry glue off as I could with my hand chisel before running it through my planer. Oh, what do you know? There's the foreman again, always watching. Once I had my pieces cleaned up a little by running them through my joiner and planer, I trimmed them to size on the table saw and then cut them to the correct widths on the miter saw. That pretty much gave me the pieces that I needed for the top and bottom support, so my next step was to figure out how to create my center post supports. Okay, so I'm working on my table base here. I got the top and the bottoms. They're about 2 3/4 inch thick. I'm going with this crisscross design here, so I need to figure out basically what this middle section height needs to be. So, excuse my drawing, completely not to scale. But if I do my math here and I figure out, I got 2 3/4 inches on top, 2 3/4 inches on the bottom. I'm gonna have a 3/4 inch foot piece, and the thickness of my oak board top is gonna be 1 5/8 inches. So it's gonna give me a height of, I'm shooting for 30 inches total height for this table. So it's gonna give me a height of 22 1/8 inch. Okay, so I got this board here. I cut these to 22 1/8 inch tall. What I did is I took the 22 1/8 and I found the center point. And then I'm gonna measure 2 inches off the center point line to figure out what I want my opening to be. I'm gonna go with a 4-inch opening for the center beam to sit in. Now what I can do is I can figure out what this measurement is, so I can cut the 2 pieces that are going to be laminated between these 2 pieces that are 22 1/8 inches, and it looks like I got 9 1/16 and about 9 1/16. Okay. So now I just need to cut those 2 pieces that'll sit in here at 9 1/16 inches. But basically, as you can see, I have my hole here in the middle that I can notch and cut for my center trestle piece, support piece to run, a runner, I guess, if you will, for the table base. So next step is I've got to glue these up. It's going to be a little bit tricky because the thing about wood glue is you get movement when you try to got glue on there and it wants to slide around. So this, I'm gonna have to try my best to clamp it as flush and as accurately as possible so that both of these center locations are going to be the same on each end. So I decided what I'm going to do to try to get the best glue up that I can get with the least amount of movement is I've got it about as flush as I can get it without clamps. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pencil and sort of mark here where these are sitting. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to maybe take a measurement about 1 inch off of that line on each side. I'm gonna make sure that I do not put any glue further than that line because I don't want there to be any squeeze out here in the middle. And also I want to prevent as much of that movement as I can. So I'm gonna try that trick, see if that works. Okay, here she is. I got her halfway clamped up. I decided I was just gonna do one section at a time so I could have more control over it, and I did good here. I didn't get much glue squeeze out, so setting it back an inch off that ended up working out. But man, this thing really wants to move when you clamp it. I don't exactly have the best clamps for it. I don't have any parallel clamps. That's something I'm working on getting, but the parallel clamps would have worked probably a lot better here. But I think I've got enough on there to hold it, let it set up, and then I'm gonna add the other piece on top of that. And then I get to do this all over again one more time for the other side. Now that I had my center support pieces glued together, I took them over to the joiner to clean them up and get them completely flush. And as it turns out, I needed them to be just a little bit less wide, and because this was now too big to run through my table saw, I had to trim a little bit off of each side with my circular saw, but hey, no big deal. Okay, so I did laminate these pieces together. This one's pretty good. The other one, there's a few cracks here, and because this is probably going to be such a heavy table, I want to make sure that I've got enough support to support it. So what I'm going to do is just add a few screws to this piece to just help with the stress that's going to be caused. My next step for this table base was to create a recess in my top supports that a 1.5 inch thick support stretcher piece could sit down inside of. Now, there are several different ways that you could do this. The way that I decided to do it was to set and lock the depth on my miter saw so that it only cut about halfway through the piece. Then I made several passes with my saw until I reached the width that I wanted to cut out. You guys want to talk about an arm workout? Whew.
Where'd you get those muscles? I've created my own workout routine that's giving me amazing results.
Anyways, after I cut one side out, I would then cut the other side until I had 4 equal recesses on both of my top support pieces. Making all of those cuts on the miter saw left behind very thin layers of wood that I was able to knock down with a hammer and then clean up with a hand chisel. Once I had it close to flush with the chisel, I finished off the rest with a sander and got a nice flush fit. The last design feature that I had to complete for the top support was to bevel each of the edges. I did this by setting my miter saw to 30 degrees and cutting each end. For the bottom supports, I traced a rounded profile and then cut them over my bandsaw, which I totally forgot to film. Sorry about that, guys. Once I had each piece cut out, I then sanded each piece with my orbital sander until I had the profile that I was looking for. Lastly, I ran over all the pieces with a 1/8 inch roundover bit on my palm router just to take down all of those sharp edges. The last thing I did before assembly was apply lots of wood filler and then completely sand each of the pieces to their final grit. It's finally time for me to start assembling these support pieces for the table base. Because I was going to be attaching a trestle support between both of these pieces, it was pretty imperative that I got these lined up and attached perfectly. So how I went about doing that was finding the center point of each of my pieces and setting my gauges accordingly. I made marks to give myself some visual guides when attaching. With the bottom piece flipped over, I drilled 4 holes with a countersink drill bit, then flipped the piece back over to apply some wood glue before attaching the center support piece. From there, it was simply a matter of lining everything up, clamping it in place, and sinking some 4-inch screws from the bottom through the holes I pre-drilled. When it came to attaching the top piece, it was a pretty similar process. I took the time to make sure everything was lined up, pre-drilled some holes, this time on the top, added glue, clamped it up, and attached my screws. Voila! One down. I follow these exact same steps for the other table base, making sure to get my center piece perfectly lined up with the other one I just did, and just like that, I had both of my table base pieces assembled. Okay, so I got the sort of frame here assembled. So what I'm going to work on next is I need to make some feet that'll sit under there, that'll have some 45-degree chamfers on the front. So I need to cut those to size on the table saw and get those ready to be glued up and attached into the base here. To create the feet for the table base, I cut out some squares on my miter saw that were slightly wider on each side than the base of my table legs. Once I had the squares cut, I set my table saw blade to cut at a 45-degree angle, and then I ran each side through to give me the beveled edge I was wanting. Once I had the pieces fully cut to size, I simply attached them to the base using a combination of wood glue, clamps, and some brad nails. I need to add these cross brace supports here, and then one will go up on the top like that. And I need to figure out how I'm going to be able to join these. I'd love to be able to use, some dominoes or something like that, but I don't have a domino joiner, so your girl's got to work with what she's got. So I think because this is going to be painted, I can conceal screws here. So I'm going to drill a 1/2 inch. Use a 1/2 inch drill bit to drill here and here. And then I've got these 1/2 inch dowling rods that I picked up that I can plug the holes with. So I think that's the approach I'm going to take. So let's go get that done. For these cross brace pieces, I started by ripping a board down to about 3 3/4 inches thick. I then cut them to a length of about 15 inches long. Once I had them the size I needed, I cut a 45-degree angle on each side. I also used the router to round over all the sharp edges on these pieces, and I went ahead and took the time to sand each of these pieces before attaching. Now it was time to drill some holes that I can use to screw these pieces into the base. Since these pieces were angled on each end, I had to come up with a way to drill straight holes. Now I know there are many different ways you can do this, but at the time the way I decided to achieve this result was to apply some painter's tape to both ends of my pieces. Then I attached a piece of tape under my drill bit, which I applied some CA glue to. I then sprayed my pieces with the tape on it with some activator spray, lined it up under my drill bit where I wanted it, and held it firmly in place for a few seconds while the glue set up. I had my drill bit set to the depth I wanted, and then I drilled my hole. Once I had one side drilled, I flipped the piece over, laid down a new piece of tape, and repeated the process. Now, I gotta say this process worked pretty well, although it was time consuming and used up a good bit of tape and CA glue. So halfway through drilling these holes, I had a bit of an aha moment and decided to simply create a jig with some scrap wood that sort of helped clamp each piece in the same place. While I didn't get any video footage of that, just trust me when I say it sped up the process a lot. If you've ever had to paint something that's one of these X cross brace designs, then you already know how much of a pain it can be to paint this section right here. You can just never get at it very good with a brush or whatnot. So here's a little tip that I had to learn the hard way. Paint this side before you attach it. All right, now that I've done all the prep work for these pieces, I've got paint on one side, I've got holes drilled on this side. The next step is to actually attach it to the base. So how I'm gonna do that is I'm gonna find the center point of each of these pieces and line it up. I'm gonna throw glue on both ends. I've got these 2-inch screws here that I'll be drilling into each of my holes. I'll probably also throw some brad nails in the back here just to prevent any of that movement. And then once I have my piece fully attached to the base, the next step will be to take the 7/16 inch dowel, and that's the same size as my holes, by the way, and I'll use that with some wood glue to plug each of my holes. And then once the glue's fully dried, I'll come back with my flush cut saw, trim all that off, sand it smooth, and then this piece will be ready to go. Now, that's sort of how the process goes for this. Now I just have to do it for each of my pieces on my base. So let's go get that done. Well, would you look at that? This is really starting to look like a table, huh? Now, after getting the pieces attached, I took my dowel rod and cut it into several pieces to use as plugs for the holes that I drilled. I added a generous amount of wood glue to both the holes and the plugs and then hammered them in tight. I let these dry overnight and then came back the next day and sawed them off. I guess this would be a good time to mention that I've also been making an identical bench to go with this dining table. So everything you've seen me do so far, I've replicated with this bench just on a smaller scale. And my last step before paint was simply to sand everything smooth. Let me just take a quick second to introduce you guys to my mom, who is the absolute best. She offered to come hang out and help prime and paint everything, which was a huge help. We primed all the pieces by hand before taking them outside to give them several spray coats of paint. The only thing is, my mom hasn't quite gotten used to this whole filming a YouTube video thing, so I had to remind her quite often actually that she was blocking the camera, which I think generated a pretty hilarious reaction from her. She's gonna be pretty embarrassed when she sees this. Love you, Mom. My next step for the table base was to notch out my center support piece so that it would fit into each of my openings on my 2 table base pieces. I simply took the time to measure out how much I wanted to cut off, and then I made the cut with the jigsaw. This is one of those moments where I forget that I do in fact have a bandsaw that I could use for a cut like this, but hey, the jigsaw worked just fine. Once I had my piece cut, I cleaned up any rough areas with my sander before finishing it off by rounding over all the edges with my router. Now it was time to start assembling the table base together and basically pray that I didn't screw something up. And spoiler alert, it actually fit on the first try.
Super duper, yeah! Super duper! That's nice! Way to go, neato!
But you best believe that I will probably screw something up eventually. Mistakes in building are always going to happen, but I prefer to look at them like Bob Ross so famously referred to them as happy little accidents. I've made a lot of mistakes over my previous builds, but they have only helped me learn and get better, so I guess I'm pretty good with that. Alright, now that I've got my tabletop roughly assembled, my next step is to figure out how I'm going to attach these stretcher pieces as well as my tabletop to my table base. And basically how I'm going to do that is with a system of threaded inserts and joint connector bolts. I'm going to use those threaded inserts and joint connector bolts to attach my stretcher pieces, and then I'm also going to put some threaded inserts on the underside of my tabletop that I can then pre-drill some holes that some joint connector bolts can attach through into the threaded inserts on the underside of my tabletop. Now I'm gonna make sure that I oversize my holes here on these pieces to allow for seasonal wood movement. So my next step is to go ahead and pre-drill all of my holes in these pieces. So let's do that. Prior to drilling my holes, I measured each of my pieces and marked where exactly I needed my holes to go. Once I had my pieces marked, I used a center punch to give me a good guide to start drilling. To oversize my holes, I used a 35mm Forstner bit with my drill press to drill my first hole. Then I came back and drilled a second hole all the way through the piece with a 3/8" drill bit. For the holes that will be used to attach the base to the tabletop, I simply flipped my stretcher piece over and marked and drilled 5 holes per stretcher. My next step was to figure out exactly where I needed to drill my holes for my threaded inserts. To figure this out, I installed my stretcher pieces, making sure they were positioned correctly and everything was square. Once I had everything where I wanted it, I took a center punch and transferred a mark through the holes that I drilled into my base pieces. This mark would tell me exactly where I needed to pre-drill my holes for my threaded inserts. To set my drill depth for my holes for the threaded inserts, I simply took the drill bit stop collar from my Craig jig and used it on this 3/8" drill bit and set it so that my holes would be just slightly deeper than the size of my threaded inserts. Using my marks and stop collar, I simply drilled 4 holes for each of my openings. To attach my threaded inserts, I applied a little bit of CA glue to the threads before slowly threading them into the holes that I had drilled. And it was during this step that the foreman showed up and enforced a mandatory pet break, which I was 100% participating in. Hey, he's the boss around here. Next, I placed joint connector bolts through the holes that I had pre-drilled in my stretchers, lining them each up with my threaded inserts and tightened each one securely. My last task for the table base was installing some feet levelers in each of my foot pieces. With the table flipped over, I used a 2" Forstner bit to drill my first hole, followed by drilling a little bit over 2 inches deep with a 7/16" drill bit. With my holes drilled, the next step was to hammer the threaded insert into the holes and screw the feet leveler into it. With this last step done, my table base was finally fully assembled. Now that I pretty much had the table base built and ready to go, it was time to get started on the tabletop. Now if you're wondering why I had to bring in the big guns, aka my husband, for the next couple of steps, well, let me fill you in on a little secret.
I'm not as strong as that guy.
Anyways, I'm not that weak, guys, but come on, these boards were like over 2 inches thick and about 10 feet long, so they were heavy, and luckily this guy stepped in to help me lug these big boys around. After getting all of the individual boards milled to the correct size, I started to adjust the boards to get the best layout for my glue up. Once I had my layout established, I marked each of the boards where I planned on cutting biscuits, then took them outside and cut biscuits in each board according to my marks. And now it's time for the scariest step of all, the glue up.
My God! Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm.
What's the
Everybody
procedure,
stay calm.
everyone? What's the procedure?
Okay, that was a bit dramatic. I don't know if it's just me, but whenever I glue something up this big especially, I always get a little bit stressed out and nervous to make sure everything goes right. The thing with glue-ups is you're sort of under a time crunch, so pre-planning your approach and making sure you have everything you need close by is clutch. It also helps to have a glue-up friend, or in my case, a glue-up spouse. He really has helped me out a bunch, hasn't he? Don't worry, guys. He ropes me into helping on all of his car renovations, so I guess we're even. Once we had applied a generous amount of wood glue to the boards and lined up all of the biscuits, all that was left was clamping everything together using some pipe clamps. We did add some clamping caws on the edges and in the middle to try and make sure that this table was as flat as we could get it. I mean, people are going to eat on this table after all, and they can't have their dinner roll, rolling onto the floor. See what I did there? Dinner roll, rolling.
That's terrible. It's just not funny or cool.
Anyways, after using just about every single clamp I owned on this thing, I left it overnight to dry before coming back the next day and removing the clamps. With the tabletop glued up, the next step was to trim it on each end to get it to its final dimension of 7 feet. I've got to say this tabletop turned out pretty flat from the glue up, so there wasn't too much sanding I had to do. Using a good amount of biscuits on a large glue up like this can really help with that. Using the belt sander and 80 grit sandpaper, I lightly sanded over the entire surface of the table until I got it completely flush. My next step was to chamfer the edges of the table using a chamfer bit and my router. If I had to give out the most important tip for routing the edges of a table by hand, it would probably be this: go slow. An arguably even more important tip would be to not get your fingers anywhere near the router bit, but I thought that one was pretty obvious. But seriously, go slow and make sure that the ball bearing on the router bit is following along the edges and your router always remains flat on the table. That is crucial. Also take the time to prep your piece and make sure your edges are flat, even, and hopefully free of any sort of knots. Speaking of knots, you might have a few in your piece, and don't you dare think that a piece of wood is no good because of them. Dramatic again, yes, but seriously, there are so many ways that you can salvage wood by filling in these knots, and I personally find the knots to add to the charm of a piece of wood. But you have to make them functional, right? Can't just have a giant hole in your table or that dinner roll might... Never mind. For this table, I'll be filling each of the voids, checks, and cracks with a thick-set epoxy. Because this is such a complex process and I learned a ton from doing it for the first time, I made an entire video just about that, so make sure to check out that video already on my channel. Since I made a separate dedicated video about tips and tricks for using this epoxy, I'll keep this pretty short and sweet. Basically, I used a thick-set epoxy from Total Boat to fill these knots, and some of them are pretty deep. Total Boat is known to have a pretty low VOCs, but it's always a good idea to wear a respirator and definitely wear gloves as well. This epoxy needs to be mixed in a 3-to-1 ratio of resin to hardener. Here's a little tip for you. Spend a little bit of money and buy the pumps from Total Boat. They take all of the guesswork out of it. It's as simple as 1 pump for each. Then it's time to mix the two together. Now I mixed this together for about 3 minutes before adding some black pigment powder to my mixture from Black Diamond Pigments. I made sure that all of my powder was mixed in evenly. When it came time to fill in my knots, you can pour it straight from the cup, but I picked up some of these craft syringes off Amazon that I used to slowly fill each of my knots with. I think it just helped keep things a little cleaner and kept excess epoxy off the table so I didn't have more to sand off later. Now, thick-set epoxy typically takes about 5 to 7 days to cure in a wonderfully idealistic temperature of 77 degrees. But it's January and I have a foot of snow outside my shop right now, so that ain't happening. I did my best to create a little heat room for the epoxy to cure in, and while I couldn't maintain a 77 degree environment, I tried to stay above or right at the minimum of 65 degrees. I let the table cure for a good deal longer than the suggested time frame because of the temperature. Luckily, it did cure just fine, it just took its sweet time. Lastly, after letting the epoxy sink in some, I came back with a heat gun and removed all of the air bubbles. Now, due to the cold temperatures, I let this epoxy harden up well over a week before I even touched it. Prior to sanding, I made sure to scrape off any of the areas with really thick epoxy so as to make sanding just a little bit easier. My next step was to sand off all the remaining epoxy with my belt sander using some 80 grit sandpaper. Now since this is going to be a dining room table, I made sure to really fill everything with epoxy so there weren't any voids, which meant I had quite a bit to sand off. I wish that when I tell you guys that I spent this day sanding for hours, it was merely an exaggeration, but it is not, my friends. You really want to make sure that you take the time and get all the epoxy sanded off. Remember too that I was using thickset epoxy, which is a bit thinner and can really seep into places and seal your wood. So it's very important that you take the time to not only remove the epoxy from the surface, but sand enough to open those wood fibers back up to accept your finish. After finishing up with the belt sander, I switched over to my orbital sander to do more, yep, you guessed it, sanding. One thing I like to do before sanding each grit is to take a pencil and mark all over your piece. That way when you're sanding, you can see everywhere that you have sanded well enough because your mark will be gone. For this table, I sand it from 80 grit up to 150 grit. Now oftentimes I do sand to a higher grit than that, but what I like to do is take a scrap piece of your wood and use it as a sample to test how your stain or finish will look for different grits. For this particular wood, 150 grit was the golden ticket, so I stopped there, which, if I'm being honest, I was relieved because I believe I'd reached my limit for sanding in one day.
I'm pretty tired. Think I'll go home now.
Before sanding my piece to its final grit, I like to do something called water popping. Basically, I just spray water over my entire piece. The water will actually cause all of those wood fibers to be raised, which I then come back and sand them down. I'm going to be using a water-based finish for this table, so water popping will help me make sure that those wood fibers aren't raised when I apply my finish, which will help me get a really smooth finish on my table. Once I'm done sanding, I make sure to get all of the sanding dust off the table to make sure to allow it to accept stain and finish. I use the shop vac to vacuum up the bulk of the dust, and then I come back and wipe everything down with a tack cloth. With my tabletop fully sanded and prepped, the next step was to apply stain and finish. The stain that I went with for this table was called Ebony from Minwax. In addition to the stain, I decided to use General Finishes High Performance Water-Based Top Coat in Satin. And with a little help from my favorite guy again, I applied a liberal amount of stain to the entire table while he made sure to wipe it in fully, and then I let it soak in for about 15 minutes before coming back and completely wiping off all of the excess. After letting the stain dry for over 24 hours, it was time for me to apply my finish. Now, since I've been building this table during the winter time, it was a little bit too cold to spray my finish on, so I opted to apply it by hand instead using some disposable paint pads. I applied 3 coats of my finish, sanding in between each of my coats with 320 grit sandpaper. And all that was left now was for me to attach my tabletop to my table base. With the table flipped over, I lined it up where I wanted it, and then I drilled some holes to install my threaded inserts into. That, my friends, is how to make a farmhouse trestle-style dining room table. This is the first time I've tackled building a table like this, and I'm pretty proud of how it turned out. I learned so much along the way, as I hope some of you did. For those that made it this far in the video, thank you. I know this was a long video, but let me tell you, this was a long build. I try my best to make it as concise as possible, but I wanted to try and bring you guys along for every step of the build. One last thing, if you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons. That really helps my channel grow and I would truly appreciate it. Also, if you want to check out any of the products that I used in this video, I have them all linked in the description box below. And that's going to wrap up this video, friends. Thanks so much for following along. I'll see you guys for my next video. Bye.